Hello, and thank you for having me. Thank you for the introduction. And I'm really sad that I can't be there in Portugal with many of you today, but this talk is actually best suited for remote presentation because that's, as the title here implies, exactly what this talk is about. I'm here to talk to you today about a new way of interacting with data visualization, one that is intended for when you're talking to a remote audience like I'm doing right now. And I describe this as a form of webcam augmented reality for touchless interaction with visualization. And just as a little preview of what I mean here, what you're seeing here is a live interactive map of all of the Data Visualization Society State of the Industry survey respondents from last year. So I'm originally from Canada. And last year we had about 66 people respond to that survey. And I'm currently based in Seattle, Washington, where there was over 700 respondents last year. And for those of you in Portugal, it looks like there were 10 respondents from last year. So this is just a little example of what I mean by standing behind your data. I don't mean it metaphorically. I mean from your audience's perspective, to actually look as though you are standing behind data. All right, before I get ahead of myself and talk more about this technology and what I am using it for, I should provide a little bit of context here. So I am with Tableau Research. So many of you probably use and are familiar with Tableau as a product. Turns out that Tableau has a small industrial research team, and it has existed for the last 11 years. So Tableau Research was founded in 2012. We are a very small group within the company. There's currently just 6 of us. Most of us come from an academic background, mostly computer science or computer graphics, data visualization, databases, and in my case, human-computer interaction. We're not a user research team, and we're also not a market research team. We're kind of an unusual product research team that we're trying to look at new ways of seeing and understanding data, new interaction methods, new prototypes, and just trying to invent what is that future for interacting with data. I should also say, just as a caveat, you can check out some of our work, by the way, at our site, tableau.com/research, that we don't make product decisions. And if you're thinking or about to ask a question in the chat at any point during my talk today about when is any of this going to be in Tableau, my answer is I don't know. Those decisions are out of my hands, above my pay grade. That's as best as I could do. Sorry. So with that, I'd love to tell you a bit more about this project and what I have envisioned for it and where I think it's going and how you might be able to contribute to this work. So a few years ago, I started at Tableau Research in 2019, in the fall of 2019 to be specific. So I was only there for a few months before the pandemic happened. So when I joined Tableau, I was curious about how do people talk about data in situations like this, in the boardroom, where seemingly decisions are being made around data. Someone might be sharing a presentation, they might be using a projector, they might be pointing at data, they might be trying to change minds and persuade people in the room with them. Of course, a few months after I joined, this happened, and everyone was suddenly meeting with all their peers, their customers, their stakeholders, all entirely online. And so that really changed a little bit of my focus of my research. How are people now talking about data with remote audiences? And of course, if you are presenting or talking about data, you're likely going to be using visual aids like data visualization. And it might look a little bit like this. So this is just a silly, simple example of me screen sharing some slides that have data viz on them. So some bar charts or some maps, or I might be using some reveals in my slide deck. I might be using some highlighting techniques. I might be pointing things out with my mouse cursor, but they are largely static images on slides. Of course, you could also share interactive vizzes and dashboards if you were screen sharing something like Tableau. But in conversation with most of our stakeholders and customers, most people are still just sharing slides with data viz on them. So I was wondering, can we rethink how we present data to remote audiences? And that made me revisit some of the classic work by Hans Rosling. Hans Rosling, I'm sure it came up in Aritra's talk about an hour ago, but Hans Rosling was a legendary presenter of data. He was just amazing at capturing our attention. But one thing I really came back to, and I went back and watched his mid-2000s era TED Talks, and even if you have seen them, I do recommend revisiting them and paying special attention to his physical presence on the stage. So this is just a short GIF, but if you watch his full presentation, he really uses his whole body. He walks across the stage, he frames things with his hands, he points at data points, he animates with his hands as the data animates. His body language really helps direct your attention as the audience. This is, of course, in the mid-2000s, and especially recently when we've seen a lot more data viz in places like broadcast news. We're seeing a lot more of this now. So some recent examples that I really like and was inspired by, people like Casey Briggs for ABC News Australia. This is an example of him standing next to a large touchscreen display in the newsroom, and this was going on broadcast about COVID trends. He's able to touch and point and trigger annotations in that line chart behind him. Or if you are in the UK, you might be familiar with Ed Conway from Sky News, who has this very large wall-sized display behind him, and he's able to walk from one viz to another and use his hands to also reinforce that animation that's happening to really draw your attention to that new viz. So, of course, I don't have a large touchscreen display at home. I don't have a wall-sized display behind me, and most of the people we speak to at Tableau, most of our customers don't either. And if you are a remote worker and you're trying to present online, you probably don't have those things at home with you either. So that led me to improvise. So a couple of years ago, I started on this project in which I had bought a cheap green screen, and I made this simple web application that was controlled by a pose recognition system. So if you're curious, there is a longer talk about this. It's a couple of years old. It's called The Information in Our Hands from the Info Plus conference in 2021, in which I use a pose recognition model that I trained on a few different distinct poses that would trigger some event in the visualization behind me on the green screen. So in this case, it's a scatter plot. And if I move my hands in one direction, the scatter plot might update or progress in time. Or I might use my hands to frame parts of the chart, and that would trigger reference lines or reference bands. But as you might note, even from this little short GIF that you see here of me from a couple of years ago, the poses are really stilted. It just seems unnatural. I'm constantly looking over at a reference display. The pose recognition model itself was very brittle. I had to maintain those poses very specific poses, and if I varied, it would be very easily confused. I had to stand in a specific place. It just seemed very unnatural and stilted overall. So I thought, I got to return to the drawing board. This is just not working. Although it is just a cheap solution. It is a cheap green screen, it's a webcam, and a off-the-shelf pose recognition model. So it was getting at that demographic of people that don't have touchscreen displays at home or for presenting remotely. So back to the drawing board, and that made me revisit another great Hans Rosling video from a few years later. So there's a short video he produced with the BBC in 2010 called 200 Countries, 200 Years, 4 Minutes. And if you haven't seen this, again, it's only 4 minutes long. I highly recommend watching it. It's a really captivating video from 2010. And I'll just make it a little bit bigger here for a moment. This is just a short GIF from it. One of the things you notice in this particular video of Hans Rosling is that it makes the video looks as though he's standing behind this projection of data visualization, and that his posture and the gestures that he makes it seem as though he's controlling the data visualization, in this case this animated scatter plot, with his body, with his hand. He's almost as if he's pulling the data points towards him. Of course, this was 2010, and this was done with a visual effects team at the BBC. This was largely done in post-production, and with some very careful choreography on his part. I was curious, in 2022 or 2021, when we started this project, could something like this be done live today and cheaply so that anyone could do it? So I started working with a doctoral candidate at the University of Michigan named Brian Hall, who joined me as an intern at Tableau Research in 2021 and 2022. And then I also started working with Professor Lynn Bartram from Simon Fraser University, professor who also has a deep knowledge of education in computer science and STEM in general. And she brought a lot of expertise in terms of how people use gesture and physical presence and body language, especially when presenting technical or abstract concepts in STEM. Turns out that a lot of our understanding when we're talking about these complex abstract concepts, it really helps if the speaker is giving multimodal cues, not only their speech, but also their use of illustrative gesture, metaphorical gesture, and what they call deictic gesture, or pointing and illustrating and framing with your hands at specific visual elements, especially if you're using a visual display as an aid. So we started, the group of us started experimenting with some recent computer vision technology for continuous hand tracking, and we were similarly inspired by that Hans Rosling video, which looked as though the visualization was composited in the foreground in this video. And we thought, can we do this live now with existing off-the-shelf computer vision technology and commodity hardware? And if you're interested, this is just an early example of some of the work that we're doing with, in this case, we were using a off-the-shelf computer vision library called MediaPipe. And if you're interested in our entire technical approach, there is an academic research paper about this. I'll drop it in the chat too, but the paper is down here in the footnote that you can go and take a look at. So I want to show you now a little case study of this experience as a presenter using this environment that we built. And once again, this is no fancy equipment. I'm using a standard webcam, doing this live, and there's nothing really advanced about what I'm about to show in terms of the technical components of this. So what I will do is I'm going to present a case study about some education data, and this is data about the cost of tuition in the state that I'm currently in, Washington State. And this is tuition data from 1965 to 2018. You also notice that I've gone to grayscale, because I find that when I'm going to be putting visualization elements in the foreground, especially if there's color and category, it helps to have that video drop into the background a little bit with grayscale. The other thing I'm going to do, just before I get started here, is trigger just these little dots on my fingers so that you can see what I'm doing with my fingers as well. All right, so a little case study here. And so to pay attention to what my hands are doing, but also let's talk about some education data as a case study. So what you see in front of you here is this area chart representing the average cost of tuition in the state of Washington over about a 50-year period, starting in the mid-60s, and it's remaining pretty flat for a while. But as you can see, around the 80s and 90s, it starts to pick up, and then it really starts to escalate in the mid-20 teens or so, starting at around that that $2,000 level on average per year back in the beginning of this period, almost quadrupling by the end of it. So you notice I've been using some pointing gestures to trigger some annotations of the data points and some reference lines depending on where I point. And these are some techniques that are available with, like, you can easily do with any chart that has an X and a Y axis. Here's some more finer scale data, because what I was showing before with this white curve was just the average across all institution types. But of course, there's different types of post-secondary education institutions in the state of Washington. There's colleges, there's comprehensive four-year universities, and there's tier 1 research universities. And so they have different average tuition costs, and especially in this period since the beginning of the 2000s, really changing their behavior. But it was really in the early 80s when they started to diverge from each other, when comprehensive and research universities started to split off from colleges at the beginning. And especially if you're in a research university, your cost of tuition is really picking up around the end of the 2000s. The experience is really different depending on which generation you're in. If you went to college as a baby boomer or a Gen Xer or a millennial, your situation is quite different. Let's actually just zoom in a second on the Gen Xers. This is a pretty the period where it's starting to steadily rise. At the beginning of this period, from about $2,500 a year, and if you're at a research university, around $6,000 into this period. But if you're a millennial and attending college during this period, especially the period of, say, 2008 to 2012, at a research university, your cost of tuition on average almost doubles from $8,000 to $14,000 over the course of this period. All right, let's just step back a second and put this back into context. So a lot of change over this 50-year period. So you'll notice that over the past couple of minutes, I've done a few different things with pointing and drawing reference lines, but also using some gestures to zoom in and to pan and to control your attention and direct your attention to specific categories or values in the data. So until now, we've just also seen some temporal data, but this type of presentation environment is also really well suited for showing things like symbol maps as well. So I want to continue this case study here and look at a specific university in the state of Washington. And that's one here in Seattle where I am, which is the University of Washington, which is a research university. There's several other comprehensive and research universities in the state, but that's the one I want to focus on today. So this green curve now is showing the number of enrolled students since 1999. So I'm going to focus just on the plight of millennials during this 20-year period from 1999 to 2018. So you'll notice that at the beginning of this period, there was about 40,000 students enrolled. And at the end of this period, around 60,000. So I want to set this aside for now. It'll be helpful context for later. This curve at the bottom is the average tuition at the University of Washington over the same time period, starting in 1999. But this tuition curve doesn't tell the full story of how much money is coming into the university on a per student basis. What's missing here is state support and how much money the state provides to the university per student. So you'll notice that state support is decreasing over this period, tuition is increasing, but the other thing to notice here is that the overall per student cost, the money coming in per student, is steadily decreasing over this period. Let's break this up into individual years for a second. And just as a reminder, I want to make sure that you remember that the number of students is steadily increasing. There's 40,000 at the beginning, 60,000 towards the end of this period. But again, I want to take a closer look at that seemingly that inversion that happened in terms of where the money was coming from over this period. So let's take as a case study 2013, for instance. And I want to compare that over a 10-year period, 10 years earlier. And this is just really hammer home like how much that funding source has inverted over this 10-year period between tuition and state support. It is almost completely inverted over this period. One last thing that I thought would be interesting here is, well, there's a lot more students coming in. So what if we take the number of students and multiply that by the tuition and state support per student? And that gives us our total money coming into the university. So you notice before it was decreasing, but now if I multiply it, it is steadily increasing over this period. So the overall money coming into the university is growing, but more of that is coming in from tuition. Okay, enough of this example for a moment. Let me just step back for a moment and recap a little bit of what just happened. So you'll notice that I use a lot of different visualization types, but also several different distinct gestural cues to draw your attention. A lot of that was pointing and using reference lines. But you'll notice that some of the gestures that I was using were those that you might already be using when you're talking about numbers or data, and you might be even using these gestures unconsciously. So take, for instance, like when you talk about the passage of time, you might actually have this notion of an invisible timeline in front of you, and you might be panning in space, or you might be zooming in or zooming out. Or if you are comparing numbers, you might also be using your hands to compare things side by side. So some of these gestural cues that we recognize in this environment are already based on some of the natural gestures that people might make when talking about numbers or data. You might have also noticed that other things, like the appearance of new charts into this space, those I was automating through keyboard shortcuts. My point here is that not everything has to be gesturally controlled, because when you're presenting remotely like I am right now, you still have access to a keyboard and a mouse in front of you, and you can still use those other tools at your disposal. So the question really becomes, what would be helpful for your audience and what would be helpful for you as a presenter to keep off screen? So in this case, we chose to really focus on the diptych gestures of pointing, and to reveal annotations, and some of those rhetorical gestures that people make when they're talking about time or numbers or comparisons. But other things we relegate to the keyboard or to the mouse. Another thing to consider after watching this example is that this technology that we're using is not complicated. I'm using a standard webcam here, and we're using an off-the-shelf computer vision library. So I anticipate, after showing this to my colleagues and to several customers and now to you, that many people in the near future might think about building presentation tools like this that encompass some gestural commands. So I say this because you could conceivably add a very large gestural vocabulary to a tool like this. Or you might allow your presenters to define their own. Think about macros that you might have for your PowerPoint or for other presentation tools. You might allow people to define their own gestures. But my point is that I want to express a little bit of caution, or I think that people should be careful to make sure that you don't have gestures that conflict with natural body language and the natural gestures that people make. Sometimes even unconsciously when you're talking about data. I use my hands a lot when I'm speaking, and even when using this tool, I have to remember when and where I can use some of that body language. Seeing this example, you might also, this example presentation that I just gave about education, you might have also been reminded of other gestural interfaces you might have seen in the past, either real ones or ones that were fictional. I'm not going to show copyrighted images here from movies, but probably the two movies that you might be thinking of right now are Minority Report and Iron Man. And that's usually the two movies that people tell me that this work reminds them of. But remember that the scenes in those movies where people are talking or people are using gestures to control an interface, those interfaces are intended for data analysis rather than data communication. We just happen to be watching them in the cinema audience. The gestures that they're doing, think of Tom Cruise in Minority Report or Tony Stark navigating these complex holographic scenes. Those gestures that they're doing are for navigating complex data spaces. They're not to direct an audience's attention. It captivates us in the cinema, but it does not help us understand what they're doing. And that's just the caution I express here, that if you are going to be designing your own gestures for controlling data visualization, just to be conscious of what that gesture accomplishes. Is it mostly for your control of an interface, or does it also help guide the audience's attention towards something that they need to know? Another possibility of this space that I want to just show before I close is whether an environment like this, a presentation tool, could be useful for education scenarios or for helping people learn about data visualization. And that might entail a little bit of a different interaction pattern. Could it, for instance, help people understand that your data has distinct fields and data visualization has many fields contributing to it? So another example, just before I close, let's take a look to see at a different use case here. So this is a more recent example, which is made to look a little bit more like the Tableau experience. So if you are familiar with Tableau, Tableau has this drag and drop interface where you take fields in your data and you drag it to a canvas or to a row and shelf environment or to a set of cards. This is a bit inspired by that. So you'll notice over here, I have this icon over here that triggers a few fields that get revealed, and we have a couple of drop zones now in the presentation environment. The data that I have here, we're no longer looking at education data. We're looking at data from the OECD about flood risk. And in particular, we're looking at the Netherlands, actually. So let me just drag this out to this area here. So we have all of our provinces of the Netherlands here in this map. And I'll also drag this field over to here as well. And here we have a bar chart that is sorted by population. And so you'll notice that I drag multiple fields to this field to build up this chart. So you'll see the largest population of all the Dutch provinces is in South Holland, followed by North Holland. And then I'll also drag out this flood risk representation here. And now the bar chart is sorted by decreasing flood risk. We also have this fictional company that we have in this data set that distributes where the employees are in this environment. So you might use this environment to point out, oh, most of our employees are actually based in North Holland, but the flood risk there is relatively low. So you notice here some bidirectional linking and brushing between these two different visualizations, and multiple steps in order to build them. A little bit different than before, in which I was bringing out pre-constructed visualizations into the scene. So again, I'll just recap that there's a lot of opportunity in this space, and I'm really curious to know what this community with the Data Visualization Society and the Outlier community think about new interaction, new contexts for interaction with visualization like this, especially in the past few years when people have been transitioning to remote work or to hybrid work environments, and more people are having to talk about data in their job role, and often that entails showing some visual aids to a remote audience. So I leave you with this exercise that the next time you're talking to an audience, whether you are in person or remote, and you are sharing your screen or sharing slides behind you, think about what your hands are doing, and think about how that movement might either help or distract an audience if you were to, as I have done today, stand behind your data. And lastly, I will wanted to share one more thing about this work. I'm certainly not the only researcher out there doing work in this space, and perhaps there are those among you today watching or watching this recording later that would like to meet and talk about this topic and are thinking about interaction for supporting remote collaboration and remote communication. So I'm happy to announce that I'll be co-organizing a workshop on this topic later this year at the IEEE Viz conference in Melbourne. So especially if you are in Australia and want to come to Melbourne in October, come and participate in our multimodal experiences for remote communication around data workshop, or Mercado. And you'll find out more about this at the workshop website here. I'll also drop this information into the chat if you are interested in participating. So with that, I'll draw this short presentation to a close. I'm really interested in hearing what you have to think about this. I'm really happy that you invited me to this event, and I hope that you enjoy the rest of the conference. So thank you very much.
Lisa asks, how are the visuals created? Is there a UI like Tableau, or are they built using code? And is the end goal to make this easy for the end user to use?
That's a great question. We don't know yet what the UI for building this would look like. If it would just be like PowerPoint, or would it be like a Tableau-like experience, or would it be just a version of Tableau? We don't know yet. Currently, this is just the presentation environment, and the authoring aspect of it is like a script-based experience. So if you've used systems like Reveal.js or other like HTML-based presentation environments, it's a bit like that currently, where you have this sort of script array and you define what elements will be in each scene. But the charts here are SVG charts. A lot of this was built in Svelte. And as I mentioned before, it's using under the hood for the computer vision media pipe for tracking my hands. So a lot of off-the-shelf components here, just putting it all together into one nice little package. But how this integrates into like an interactive authoring environment, if it's a drag and drop like slide builder like experience, that's a good question, and we're still navigating in the space. But if you have thoughts, I'd really love to hear them.
Awesome. Well, thank you again so much, Matt. Lisa, Andrew, Sarah.